Good morning. This meeting, November 27th, 2023, is now called to order. I'm going to be doing roll call as well. Today, myself, Kristen, and Greg Brown are present, and President Katie Browning and Vice President Louise Jackson were unable to attend. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. There is no public comment this morning, so we're going to be moving on to our consent agenda. Today's consent agenda includes personnel report, claims, and payroll. Do I have a motion to approve these consent items?
So moved.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Is there any discussion?
Nope.
Nope. So we will now have a vote. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Motion carries 3-0. Okay. Moving on, we will now move to our action items. Our first action item is permission to advertise a public hearing on additional appropriation of first mortgage bonds proceeds. Mr. McMichael.
Thank you. This is a request to hold a public hearing for additional appropriation, or for appropriation in this case, in order to actually be able to use the bond funds. They have to be appropriated, and so that's the purpose of this planned hearing. I'd point out to you that the principal amount of these bonds is $71.5 million, but we're advertising the appropriation at higher than that amount, 75, I believe, because we would not use that much unless we should sell what's called premium bonds. You remember the Polytech project came in over the estimate, and so we don't know what other projects will come in yet as to whether we'll have enough to make that shortage up. But in the event we don't, the alternative is to include some premium bonds with this sale, and essentially what you're doing is you're not changing the principal amount, but when you sell the bonds, they're sold for higher than the face value, and then it's basically then you expand the amount that you're borrowing, but you keep the principal amount the same, and so it's a financing method, and so we want to we want to have the ability to do that if we should need to.
May I have a motion to approve action item 4.1, permission to advertise a public hearing on the additional appropriation of first mortgage bonds proceeds?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Is there any discussion? No. If we have no discussion, then I'd like to take a vote. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Motion carries 3-0. Action item 4.2, permission to advertise public hearing on the additional appropriation of funds. Mr. McMichael, that's got to be you.
Thank you. This is additional appropriation for our various tax-supported funds, and I've outlined the need for the appropriation. One significant change is in our referendum fund. You recall we talked about the fact that our assessed value went up considerably this for 2023, and so when we built the budget 18 months ago, we assumed a 5% increase, and it turned out about 13%. And as previously stated, we needed that money because we also had a shortfall in our education fund due to declining enrollment, and so that's a significant reason for the need for additional appropriation in the referendum fund. And then general inflation had a negative impact in our operations fund. So this, none of the additional appropriation it does not affect the tax rate or affect the revenue. We already have the revenue, but we need the appropriation again to be able to use the revenue that we have.
May I have a motion to approve action item 4.2, permission to advertise a public hearing on the additional appropriation of funds?
So moved.
Thank you. May I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Is there any discussion?
Yeah, just, we have spoken about this before, so I think if I'm not mistaken, the education fund went down about 2 million because of the enrollment. Is that right?
Yeah, not just this year, but over the last 3 years, we had declining enrollment, which totaled about that much, yes.
And then the assessed value gets us an increase of 2.7 million.
Yes, in the prior year, that fund went up about $700,000. So it's the 2 million is beyond what we had assumed when we built this budget.
So could you explain how we will be using that differential increase in the operating referendum as it went up more than the education fund?
Yes, it essentially, because of the loss of education fund revenue, it offset that loss. Had we not had that increase, we would have found necessary to reduce basically to make about $2 million worth of cuts in our operations.
But the operating referendum went up more than the 2 million, didn't it? Like up to about.
Well, it went up
2.7.
2.7, but we anticipated going up the 0.7. So it went up about $2 million more than what we had originally anticipated.
Okay, so the decline in enrollment, as we've spoken before, it's hard to make incremental cuts to, if we're declining enrollment, you think, well, we need less personnel,
right,
so to speak. So maybe you could talk to that a little bit.
Yes. The way the formula works, we receive a dollar amount per student, and that's an average for the total, our total expense. And so when we have declining enrollment, we do need less teachers because we have less students in the classroom. But so that if we're fortunate, and it also depends on where the students, show up or don't show up, because if you drop, 150 students over 16,000 and in 15 different schools, it may be 2 in kindergarten in this school and 1 in first grade. So that may not result in a reduction in a teacher, a classroom teacher, of course. But all the other staff that we have, other teachers such as media specialists and art, music, and PE, and counselors and social workers, and then other staff, principal, assistant principal, office staff, that staff does not reduce incrementally. So if we lose 20 kids out of an elementary school, you don't reduce that staff. Now, over time, if you decline 500 or 600 students and enough that you might close a school, for example, then you kind of catch up. But what happens then is and that's what happened to us. We were able to reduce in the classroom staff, but not the other staff, and so that covered about half of the loss, and this additional referendum money basically made up for the other half, because the second half would be extremely painful to reduce, because of the way this it works. You can't reduce when you have one media specialist, for example. You typically can't hardly reduce that position to a 0.8 for 80% or something. So it just gets very difficult to make reductions when you have declining enrollment because of the way the formula works.
Do you have any sense for where that increment might be in reduction in enrollment, where we'd have to say, okay, now we're gonna have to reduce headcount. Not that I hope we don't get to that point, but
Yeah, well, I wouldn't speculate on what, but having over my career, unfortunately, being involved with the need to make reductions, everything ends up on the table. And so you generally would look at non-personnel first, like travel and supplies and materials, but that's not where all of our money's at, as you know. The money is in people. And so if you make some reductions there, then you have to start looking at people, and it's not complicated, but it's just very difficult and painful because the question is what do you want to reduce, or what do you reduce? You don't want to reduce any of it, but as I said, understanding how schools are staffed, you have to have a principal, for example. That by state law, so you can't hardly reduce that. You wouldn't have to have an assistant principal. You don't have to have art, music, and PE teachers, but we certainly wouldn't want to start reducing those positions. You don't have to have social workers. And so there's any number of things that you're not required to have, but our community expects what we have, and we certainly want to continue to provide the services that we've been providing.
I could just add that every year, Dr. Ostrike and Mr. McMichael, we work on staffing for the next year, and we do that well in advance. So again, you're making a educated guess on some things. So it makes a projections, like when we had fewer students, for 3 years in a row. When we had retirees and at the end of the year, or people who had resigned and moved on, that's when these guys look at those positions and see, do we need to fill those positions or not? And the way as he explained it, some of those positions you have to fill because it's just not an option. But other ones maybe we don't have to fill. And then sometimes there's depending on where the groupings are of where there's fewer students, you may transfer a teacher from this building to this building, because even though we have reduction in staff in some or kids in some buildings, sometimes we have more kids in a different building. So there's this staffing puzzle that's done we do that in the spring, really even a little bit earlier in spring now, I believe. So that's kind of the only control we have in trying to determine, enrollment, if the enrollment drops versus if the enrollment stays the same, or if it increases, then we're looking at another issue to see what our class sizes are. And that's just a big balancing act. And then all the way right up until the start of school, Dr. Dudley and Dr. Ostrike are working, because we get what we call hot spots, where you'll have, out of the 25 kids that enroll in a segment of time, 15 of them are in one school. And so, so that, sometimes that necessitates another teacher, a transfer, or sometimes we'll hire an IA, so we'll have more adults in the same room. So it's a process that goes on, and these guys are pretty good at it, of course. But we're fortunate to have people that are talented, and but that's really the only control you have when you're dealing with enrollment type things. Right now we're running about same as we had last year, I believe. So we came almost exactly the same numbers as we had last year in our early count day. So I hope that's helpful.
And many of these ebbs and flows are probably pretty natural, as people moving in and out of communities, people getting transferred. And some decline was anticipated through a demographic study we did, I can't remember exactly,
Yes.
but many years ago. So
Yes.
as the community builds out, and housing becomes less available, there's going to be a decline in new families moving in, I would imagine.
You're correct about the forecast. Did project a slight decline over the next 10 years or thereabouts. What I believe the most significant factor has been is the increase in housing, and then even more significantly, the increased interest costs, and it basically has priced people out of the market. Now, I also believe that people still want to own a home and so forth. And what I believe we'll see is people will kind of readjust, and they'll spend more money on housing and less on other discretionary expenses. Because some of us remember when interest rates were twice as high as they are now, but people still bought houses and slowed down. And as I think that's happened here and all over, but if the interest rates stay, and 6% used to be the norm, it's just been several years ago, and so many people don't recall those times. And even if they did, I mean, it just becomes a matter of your salary didn't necessarily go up as much as housing prices went up, and certainly as much as interest went up. And so it just becomes a matter of people will tend to put more of their disposable income into housing, and thus less in other expenses. And I think, my optimistic side said we're starting to see that this year. As was noted, our enrollment actually went up 40 kids or something, not significant, but that's way better than losing 40 kids. And so it's come back a little bit this year as compared to the last 3 years.
Yep, I just have a comment and then a question. I've said this before, but wanted to say it again. When my oldest was in kindergarten, before the referendum, our class sizes were pretty large, at least in
Yes.
kindergarten and first grade. Larger than I would have preferred as a parent. And so I think that's because the state does not have the equitable funding for all the school districts, we have to make that up to make sure that we don't have 35, 36 kids in a classroom, especially in those, well, I guess in any elementary or upper grades. It's just a lot of kids to handle, so that was my comment. And then I had a question about, in the budget, there was a decent increase in the need for staff who work in special services and special education, and an increase in students was what was noted. Is that also driving this need for this extra money as well, because we've had an increase?
No, that not directly. We anticipated our special needs program has grown and continues to grow at a higher rate than our overall population, and so and as a result of that, we also receive more money because of that, and there's also an adjustment, as there is to the overall funding for the different exceptionalities in our special needs program.
Okay, thanks.
I have a couple more questions.
Yes,
Yeah.
sorry.
The safety referendum has a line item for operations and maintenance of plant services of $100,000. Could you explain that a little bit? I didn't know we had that kind of a cost in the safety referendum.
No, off the top of my head, I don't know specifically what that's for, but it likely has something to do with more non-personnel items. Could be, this isn't a real example, I don't believe, but we could, for example, if we buy security cameras, it might be charged to that area. But out of the $6 million, 100,000 of it doesn't, stand out to me to where I would know off the top of my head what that's for.
Okay. So if you could find that out
Sure.
for us, I would appreciate that. And then just a general comment about what we're looking at today is that the budget's already been approved, right, for 24.
Yes.
So this process is an appropriation of just saying that, we will spend that budget that was already approved. It's not so much saying we're going to increase budgets. It's just saying that the approved budget we have, you have to go through a process of appropriation. If it's not appropriated, in other words, we can't spend it, even though it's an approved budget. It's approved by the taxpayers, so to speak, as far as the mechanics of it all. But we're not really saying we're increasing budget. We're just doing a process of appropriation to spend the budget that was approved. Is that a fair statement?
Not quite, but it's close. So this appropriation is for the 23 budget, not the 24. And
Okay.
this is literally an additional appropriation. It's an addition to what was originally appropriated, 18 months ago, and, or when we started the process 18 months ago. And so, and in this case, in the operating fund referendum, we are appropriating additional revenue that we've received. So it depends on which fund. In the operations fund, we didn't receive more money than what we anticipated, but we have cash balance to begin with, and so in some cases we're appropriating the cash that we have. In all cases, there's revenue. We already have the revenue, or we wouldn't be able to. The state wouldn't approve additional appropriation if we didn't have the money to spend in the first place. So that's basically the process.
Would it be good clarification? I know you guys are just approving an advertisement, so we're getting way out off the trail here, but is it safe to say that basically what you're doing is an adjustment through appropriations to cover the costs, that are out there?
Yes.
Yeah. And I was going to make that second point, is today we're just putting this on the agendas for the public to see and discuss further, but,
All right, thank you, Roger. Appreciate all those clarifications. We'll now take a vote. If everyone will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries 3-0. All right, we'll move on to our announcements. Upcoming meetings? I don't know. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, December 18th is our next regular school board meeting, and that'll be a regular time right here. December 22nd is Teacher Work Day. Students are free to go on a winter break at that point in time. And then December 22 through January 8 is the winter break. January 8th is another Teacher Day with no students, and then the kids come back on January 9th. So get those on the calendar, and we're in the last 19 days of semester 1. Wow. Counting today. Thank you.
Thank you. Since there's no other business to come before the board today, may I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Thank you, Kristen. May I have a second?
second.
All right, let me do this. Meeting's adjourned.